Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude. Today reviewing this Spatha made by Leonardo Daneluz of Argentina. This is a recreation or a reproduction of the Feltwell Spatha. And I bought it from Leonardo for the steal of a price of $500, which still blows my mind that I can get a handcrafted, meticulously detailed reproduction of that sword by a bespoke maker for half $1,000. That's an incredibly low price. Leonardo has seemed to raised his prices a little bit since then. When I see him selling stuff, it's usually around the $800 to $1,000 price now. But those are all very detailed replicas of Spatha. It seems like it's what he likes to focus on is Spathae? I don't know. I don't know what the plural is. Spathas, maybe? Regardless, it is definitely what he likes to focus on. And he is one of the few makers out there who is really doing this type of sword and doing it justice. So when this came available on Facebook, I jumped on it. Now I should say, this is not the type of sword that I am familiar with. I do not know pretty much anything about the history of Spatha. I don't know the way to use them. I don't know much about the Feltwell Spatha that this is based on. So this is going to be my review of it, but keep in mind that this is very much out of my comfort zone. Let's start off by looking at the scabbard. This is a wood core scabbard with an untanned horsehide wrap. It's got a stitching down the back that is very strong, very even and very, very straight as well. There's copper fittings throughout a shape and then this kind of band here. All of them decorated with some punched circles, which as I understand it, are representative of the scabbard pieces that the Feltwell Spatha was found with. There's an iron, or I think this is iron, like belt loop or clip or something like that right here. This is probably what it was with the Feltwell Spatha find. This was lying a few feet away from the other parts, but it certainly has a similar look to it as the rest of the pieces. The scabbard is lined with some kind of material that I really don't know what is. I probably should have asked Leonardo what that was. I'll see if I can ask him, and if so, I will put something up on screen if he gets back to me by the time the review goes live. The scabbard is quite thin, which I really like. It's not thick and bulky, and it doesn't weigh that much, even though it has multiple metal fittings. The fit is outstanding. If I slide it in, really smooth draw. I don't know what that material that's lined the inside is, like I said, but it really makes for a very nice smooth draw. And there is absolutely no rattle at all. If I hold it upside down, it doesn't come out. Shaking, I can force it out by like pushing it down, but I really have to try to get it to fall out. And the scabbard fit has not adjusted in the weather at all. So it's been like this since I got it, through the heat, the humidity, the cold, all that kind of stuff. The scabbard fit has not changed at all, which is pretty rare in my climate. So the wood is very nicely sealed and stable, which I really appreciate. It's a beautiful scabbard. I really like it. I love the attention to detail through it. And it is really unique. You don't really see scabbards of this style made by very many people at all that I can think of. Looking at the hilt, we have an antler grip and horn guard, and I hesitate to call this a pommel, but for lack of a better word, I'll call it a pommel. The pommel and the guard are really beautifully done. The horn is very cleanly polished, and they're not the exact same size. They're the same general shape, but the guard is a little bit larger overall. The corners are very, very crisp. All the lines are very crisp, but they're not sharp. They aren't hot spots. Now, they are kind of hot spots because of how you have to grip the sword, but we'll get into that during the handling section. The point is that the attention to detail, the shaping, the finishing on these is excellent. The horn looks beautiful. There's what looks like a peen block. It could also be considered a nut, and then the peen sits a little proud on top of that. The peen itself is finished very nicely. It's got a pyramidal shape to it. Now there's a little bit of unevenness in the polish of it, but it's really nicely done. And it looks really good, and everything feels very tight and secure. The grip, like I mentioned, is antler, and once again, looks stunning and is shaped really cleanly. All the lines are very straight. The surfaces are flat and smooth, and nothing is a hot spot. It's let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a hexagonal shape to it, which I really like. It has a really good feeling in the hand. It can really grip it very nicely. I'm usually not a huge fan of antler grips because I don't usually find I have that great of a grip on them. This is not the case here. It is, even though it's very smooth, it locks into my hand very well. I think these little grooves cut into it definitely help with that because they give my fingers something to rest on and really grip it nicely. And the look of the hilt overall is just stunning. It's relatively plain. You know, a lot of Spatha, you can get some very detailed hilts, especially if you start looking past Spatha into Migration era, which have a lot of similarities. But this one is quite plain, but it is stunning in its simplicity. Where the blade meets the guard is very, very cleanly done too. It is fit to the blade almost perfectly. There's tiny spots here and there where there's a tiny gap, but it is fit to the blade very nicely. There's some serious signs of craftsmanship everywhere you look on this sword. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As usual, here's my measurements. So the first thing that strikes me about this sword, and probably most people who see it, is the pretty short blade length of right around 25 inches. That is, like I said, pretty short for a Spatha, but it is faithful to the original, the Feltwell Spatha. So that is why it's that length. You know, if you're making a reproduction, you should generally try to maintain the stats relatively similar. The blade starts at 4.8 millimeters thick and has a nonlinear distal taper. That means at the beginning, it tapers in a little bit more than 0.5 millimeter in the first 6 inches, maintains mostly the same thickness through the majority of the blade, and then does start tapering again towards the tip. It's not a ton of distal taper, but it doesn't need a lot. When you're talking about a blade this short, you don't need to thin them out quite as much because they're not as long of a lever, so you don't have as much weight out forward dragging the tip down. And this sword already is balanced quite far out from the guard. You can see on that measurements, 7.5 inches. That's a choppy sword for such a short sword. The overall geometry on this sword is gorgeous. It's a hexagonal cross-section with a very flat and super even finish in the geometry. If I'm looking down the planes of this sword, no rippling whatsoever. The lines do not waver at all. Everything is straight and beautiful. Again, there is a lot of craftsmanship that's going into this sword. The symmetry here is outstanding. Now, if you look at the tip, at first glance, it looks pretty asymmetrical. When you get closer, you realize it is a little bit asymmetrical the way the bevel transitions into the tip, but it's actually quite minor and it's incredibly well done. This is not a simple geometry to get all those different angles perfectly symmetrical. And it, like I said, at first glance, it looks pretty asymmetrical. You have to really look at it and realize, no, it's actually not very asymmetrical. It's a little bit, but not a lot. But again, the finish work of the geometry is outstanding. It's one smooth bevel from the end of the hexagonal cross-section to the edge. And again, I can't stress enough how clean the lines are and how smooth and even everything is. The geometry is gorgeous. The finish polish on the sword is a little bit rougher. There's some different colors in there. You can see some of the character of the steel in there. It's not polished to a high polish that kind of removes some of that character and just gives you that super even shiny surface. This has a bit more depth to it because you can see the details of the steel a little bit more. And while talking about the steel, this is 5160. If that matters to you, that's a really good steel for this type of sword. So let's test the sword on some paper just to see how sharp it is. So it did cut there quite evenly. It did do a little bit of tearing. This is not a super clean, smooth slice, but it is sharp enough to cut paper. Struggled to start the cut there right out towards the tip, but then once I got a little bit further down, it managed to slice into the paper pretty well. That is very effectively sharp. Certainly not the sharpest sword I've seen, but very acceptable, a good level of sharpness. Moving on to cutting with this sword. So I did a little bit. I didn't do a ton of cutting, but I did some lighter water bottles and I believe it was one paper cup. And overall, sword cuts well. It's a little tricky for me to use. Remember, this is very far outside my area of, I wouldn't even say expertise, but my area of comfort, something that it handles very differently than anything I'm used. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But it cuts very well. The edge is sharp and it will cut through light targets very well. The paper cup, you can see here, it cut right through there. Clean cut, a tiny bit of tearing in there. You can't probably see it here, but when I went and looked, there was a tiny bit of tearing. But overall, it's fun to move around, if a bit tiring, and it is a good cutter. I didn't do anything harder or tougher than these targets that you see here because it's just not really going to be very informative on the sword because I just don't really know how to use it well enough for it to be useful information, in my opinion. So let's talk about the handling of this sword. One of the first things I want to point out, if you noticed on my measurements graphic, I did not include the center of percussion. And that's because this blade is frankly too stiff for me to really be able to measure it. You can barely see any flex when I'm doing that there. If I actually try to flex it, very, very little. That's because it's a short blade that remains pretty stout throughout. It does have distal taper, but it doesn't get particularly thin, around 3.1 millimeters out around here, if I'm remembering correctly. And overall, it's balanced at 7.5 inches from the hilt, right around there. That is a lot of distance from the hilt. Now, because the blade is short, it's not overly blade heavy. It's not overly tip heavy. It doesn't feel like I'm going to just lose control of the sword and drive the tip into the ground, anything like that. It has a good overall feel to it despite having that point of balance so far out. And typically when I think of a Spatha, I think of a blade that's probably more like yay long or so, a cavalry sword oftentimes, something that you're chopping down with, doing big powerful chops with. This feels a little bit different because it is so much shorter and therefore it doesn't have quite as much weight out pulling me into those big heavy chops. Now the point of balance being 7.5 inches out, it definitely has authority and the tip is there, but I can also deliver the tip where I want it pretty easily. It's got good tip control for such a forward balanced sword. So the big thing about how to use the sword is how to grip it, in my opinion. Right now, I'm just doing a simple hammer grip. And this works, but it can be a little uncomfortable. This piece can definitely bite into the hand when you're, especially right now it's kind of a modified hammer grip. If I'm doing it more like that, really wedging my hand in there, that's good for just, chopping, but it doesn't feel good. This drives into the flub of my hand right here and bites in pretty badly, even if I'm just doing simple downward chops like that. Upward, it's a little bit less uncomfortable, but it still doesn't feel good. I was doing kind of a modified hand grip or hammer where I just kind of rotated. If this is what I was a normal hammer grip, I was just kind of cocking it a little bit so that when I swing, the grip guard kind of slides past the flub of my hand, and then I can do these cuts much better. That's how it ends up after a cut. So that works. This wasn't the best way for me that I found to use it. I tried multiple different grips while cutting, and I also tried like this, really resting the pommel against the palm, and that worked very well. What actually worked best was to choke down a little bit, more like this. And now I can really move the sword quickly, get some sword wind even there, and it works. I was flabbergasted that this worked so well, but it is absolutely what worked best for me to have good edge alignment. This, having the pommel like this, locked the sword into my hand. I can't rotate it at all. So it delivers really good edge alignment, and it also let me accelerate the sword and move it around really cleanly. I had good control, better control than I was expecting. So this was a really interesting thing. Now, one thing I'll say about this is very opposite of how I normally grip a sword, because typically my upper fingers, especially my index finger and then the thumb, are holding onto the sword and really gripping it and not doing much of powering the cut. Here, they're not gripping the sword very tightly at all. They're more barely there, and I'm really gripping it with the bottom parts, the bottom fingers. Is that a correct way to use this? I have no idea. I'm just relaying what I feel worked best for me. I have a hunch that if I'm holding it like this, I'm going to have a little bit less secure. Like if I have I impact a hard target, I could see my hand, the sword jostling in my hand, potentially even losing the grip, because these fingers don't grip as well as these two up here. Didn't try that. I'm not going to try that because I don't want to throw my sword. I don't want to lose the sword or anything like that. It's just speculation here, but it's something that I found kind of interesting. And as far as I know, we don't have any manuscripts or really much of anything about how to use this type of sword. It's all pretty much experimental because there's nothing written down as far as I'm aware. All right, bottom line, this sword was $500 brand new, directly from Leonardo Daneluz, the maker. Is it worth that price? I already gave this away at the beginning of the review. This was, frankly, a fucking steal, pardon my language. I can't believe he sold it to me for $500. It is an outstanding sword. It's an excellent representation of an iconic sword, a type that we don't see a whole lot of makers doing. And it's just gorgeous. The craftsmanship is top notch. I really can't stress that enough. Especially the attention to detail and all the geometries. Absolutely beautiful. Leonardo Daneluz deserves your attention if you want this type of sword. And he's making them fairly regularly. I see him post Spatha available to buy once, twice a month, something like that. Just off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that, but absolutely a steal, this sword. And I think the ones that are more expensive, they usually have a little more detail to them. Usually are going to be longer blades. Just outstanding. If you are at all interested in this type of sword and this kind of budget is within your grasp, around $1,000 when you're looking at most of his newer stuff, absolutely check him out. He's worth your time and attention. And that's going to wrap up this review. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Alien 2